Hi, welcome back to Joe Blogs. In today's episode, I want to talk to you about what's happening in the economy in Russia, and specifically to talk about the announcement that Joe Biden has made that Ukraine is now authorised to use long-range attack missiles produced by the USA. The Army tactical missiles, also referred to as ATACMS, are 13 feet or 4 metres long, have a range of 190 miles, and are produced at a cost of $1 million each by Lockheed Martin. Now, the timing of this announcement is really quite interesting because it comes less than 2 weeks after Joe Biden lost the presidential election and within 2 months of Donald Trump taking over as president. And Donald Trump has said that he's going to end the war in Ukraine. Originally, he said he was going to end it before he actually takes over as president, but whether or not that happens remains to be seen. But there are a lot of questions in terms of what Donald Trump is intending to do. Nobody really knows what his strategy is going forward. However, he has said on multiple occasions that he believes that the USA has contributed far more than Europe, and that Europe needs to start paying more to Ukraine to make up the difference. So there's a strong inference that there's a potential that the USA could reduce the amount of aid that it's providing to Ukraine, or potentially even look to agree some form of peace settlement whereby Russia is given the land that it currently occupies. Nobody really knows what his strategy is. But I think it's really interesting that Joe Biden at this point, before he hands over the presidency, has decided to let Ukraine use these long-range missiles because President Putin is really unhappy about this concept. And in September, he said that the West would be fighting directly with Russia if it allowed Ukraine to strike Russian territory with Western long-range missiles. At that time, he said, if this decision is taken, it will mean nothing less than the direct involvement of NATO countries, the United States and European countries in the war in Ukraine. This will be their direct participation, and this, of course, will significantly change the very essence and the very nature of the conflict. And Russia will be forced to take appropriate decisions based on the new threat. And it was reported by TASS, the Russian state news agency, that Vladimir Zaborov, first deputy head of the Russian Upper House International Affairs Committee, said this is a very big step towards the start of World War III. So at face value, this looks like a very serious turn of events and comes almost exactly 1,000 days into the conflict. The 1,000th day will be the 19th of November. And this war is the single most expensive thing that Russia is investing into at the moment. It's estimated that in 2024, Russia will have spent over $100 billion on the war, and in 2025, the budgeted figure is $145 billion. That is a huge amount of capital, significantly more than Russia is spending on things like healthcare and education. And the official reason why the USA has agreed to the use of long-range missiles is because North Korean troops have been deployed into the Kursk region. In June 2024, during a visit to North Korea, the first since 2000, President Putin signed a mutual defence pact with North Korea, whereby the two countries agreed to come to each other's aid in the event of armed attacks. And that mutual defence treaty was made law in Russia on the 9th of November and subsequently ratified by North Korea. Now, in terms of the impact that the use of these long-range missiles could have on the war in Ukraine, this map shows the 190-mile strike range that these missiles would have from the Ukrainian border and highlights all of the military and paramilitary sites in Russia that Ukraine could target. And as you can see, there are a myriad of different sites spread all across the Russian territory. And what this means from Russia's point of view is that they now need to have a defence strategy in place to be able to protect all of these different locations. Now, up until this point in the war, Ukraine's option in terms of attacking these sites was limited to drones. And we've talked about this in previous videos. Ukraine is using a lot of drones. However, drones are relatively small and the warheads that they carry are relatively limited, whereas the US attack missiles are far larger and will be travelling at much higher speeds, so therefore they're going to be more difficult for Russia to try to intercept. Now, obviously at this point nobody knows where Ukraine is going to deploy those missiles first, but the market consensus is that they're likely to use them to try to defend the Kursk region, which is the 1,000-mile square territory within Russia that Ukraine is currently occupying. And this is something that Ukraine is trying to defend because Russia is pushing heavily to get Ukrainian forces back out of that area. And what's likely, I think, from the use of these missiles is that it will prolong that position and therefore could mean that it carries on until Donald Trump takes over. But if we quickly jump back to this map and have a look at all of the positions that show an aeroplane on them, so the round circles that have a plane logo, these are all of the bases where Russia has jet fighters. So basically they're the military locations where jet fighters would be taking off to attack Ukraine. And it's been reported that Russia is currently in the process of moving a lot of its jets to outside of the 190-mile strike range. And what that's going to do is firstly disrupt any plans that Russia had to use those jets within the near future, but also it's going to add a lot more cost because they're going to have to pay to have everything relocated, and then any jet fighter strikes that are authorised in the future, obviously they'll need more fuel because they're coming from a longer distance. They're going to be more than 200 miles from the border. So what's the summary and conclusion today? Well, I wanted to post this video because I think the announcement that the USA have now approved the use of their long-range missiles for Ukraine is really a big turning point in the war. This is something that Ukraine have been desperate to get into place for a long period of time and potentially changes the face of the conflict. Now, it doesn't mean that Ukraine now has the upper hand. Russia still has more military firepower and it has more finance in terms of being able to keep this war going. But what it does do is change the potential strike zones within Russia. Up until this point, Ukraine had been limited to using drones, and some of those drones are quite homemade. You've seen from the footage that I've shared with you, these are things that are being made in workshops. But the use of American missiles that are costing around $1 million each to produce and can travel almost 200 miles will change the face of the conflict and means that Ukraine can cause a lot more damage if those missiles strike the targets that they're intending. Now, the map that we looked at earlier showed all of the military sites that Ukraine could hit, and there are lots of them spread all across Russia. And so that's going to cause a lot of concern in Russia and means that they're going to have to pay a lot more to get defence systems in place. But obviously Ukraine may not limit their strikes to military locations. They could go for things like bridges and infrastructure, which would also cause a lot of disruption for Russia, particularly if they decide to target the Crimea area, because the bridge that links Crimea is one of the big supply bridges. And if that was to be taken out, then it would cause major problems from Russia in terms of keeping the supplies going to that region. So there is a lot of things that could happen now that Ukraine has the ability to use these missiles. Now, in terms of how many missiles they have, nobody really knows. That hasn't been disclosed. So we don't know whether they've got a huge arsenal or just a small number. And whether or not the supply will continue when Donald Trump takes over from Joe Biden, I think, is one of the big questions. And the timing of this announcement is one of the most interesting things because it's coming right at the end of Joe Biden's reign as president. He's handing over to Donald Trump on the 20th of January, and he's approved this around 2 months before he leaves. And it does raise the question as to why he's done it at this point. The official answer to that is because North Korea have supplied around 10,000 troops that are now being deployed in the Kursk region. But the question is that really sufficient for the USA to say, okay, you can now use all long-range missiles? Or is this a case of Joe Biden trying to increase the support to Ukraine at a time when there's a question mark over whether or not Donald Trump will continue with the same sort of level? But one of the other questions that this approval raises is what Europe is going to do, because the UK and France have a similar missile system to the American one, and they've also said that Ukraine is not allowed to use it. But now that the USA have approved the use of their missiles, there is a lot of pressure on the UK and France to do the same. And if they do, then obviously that would increase the amount of missiles that Ukraine have, and also would further potentially draw in the UK and France into the threats that are being made by President Putin. Because Russia has said that if these missiles are used, then they will deem that as being NATO joining the conflict, and they will take whatever action they deem to be appropriate. So there is a real risk here that Russia could target a NATO country if they think that these missiles are causing them a lot of problems. But the overall summary of today's video is that the USA has now approved the use of long-range missiles. The use of these missiles is likely to cause Russia a lot of problems in terms of defending its own territory. That's going to increase the costs of this war from Russia's perspective. The use of the missiles is also likely to prolong the war because it's going to push Russia back and it's going to cause them problems if Ukraine is successful with using those missiles to take out some of the military targets within Russia. That's going to increase the cost, which will put further pressure onto the Russian economy because this war is going to cost $145 billion in 2025, and that's on top of the $100 billion that Russia's invested in 2024 and the huge amount that it invested in 2022 and 2023. And so the longer that this war goes on, the more pressure will be applied to the Russian economy, and that's obviously going to be bad news for the long-term prospects for Russia. So hopefully you've enjoyed today's episode, you found it useful, informative and thought-provoking. If you've liked what I've said, then please give me a thumbs up. Thank you for watching this video all the way through to the end, and here's something to put a smile on your face.